Hello. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to this event titled The Value Chain Approach to Action on Sustainable Consumption and Production. I am Lisha Narona, Director of the Economy Division, and I'm very pleased to moderate this event. Before we start, I would like to share a few tips on the use of our virtual meeting today. Speakers and panelists are invited to activate their video when speaking and to mute their microphone while others are speaking. Participants are automatically muted by the system. If you wish to raise a question or comment, please type your suggestion in the chat box. Interventions through the chat box can be made at any time during the session. The chat box will be monitored, and I will address as many questions as possible during the Q&A. I invite all speakers and panelists to respect the time allocated to them for their interventions so that we can all engage in a very fruitful Q&A. So the main objective of this event is to present the value chain approach developed by the One Planet Network and the International Resource Panel Task Group, which included in a new publication released today called Catalysing Science-Based Policy Action on Sustainable Consumption and Production, the Value Chain Approach, and its application to construction and food and textiles. This event will have two parts. Part one will be a presentation of the report, value chain, and part two will be the panel discussion on some of the messages from the report, followed by a Q&A. I would like to first introduce the speaker and the panelists, all members of the One Planet Network IRP Task Group. Task Group member Arthur Eijs of the Ministry of Infrastructure and Environment of the Netherlands will present the value chain approach applied by the Task Group, key steps, features, and the added value of such an approach. Mr. Rodrigo Rodriguez Dornequist, Secretary of Climate Change, Sustainable Development and Innovation of Argentina, and Chair of the 10YFP Board. We have Mr. Lee Hendo Reuters, the Regional Manager of the South African National Cleaner Production Center, representing the Department of Environmental Affairs, Forestry and Fisheries of South Africa. Ms. Isabella Teixeira, Co-Chair of the International Resource Panel and the former Minister of Environment of Brazil. And Mr. Rijit Sengupta, Chief Executive Officer of the Center for Responsible Business in India. Very warm welcome to all of you, and we really look forward to having this discussion a little later with you. But first, let us hear an important message from UNEP's Executive Director on a video.
There are many drivers to the three planetary crises: the crisis of climate change, the crisis of nature loss, and the crisis of pollution. But the key common driver is how we produce and consume and waste our natural resources. Resource extraction and processing account for over half of our greenhouse gas emissions. They account for around 1/3 of the impact of human health, and they account for the lion's share of biodiversity loss and water stress. Even so, we continue to use ever more natural resources. Meanwhile, the efficiency with which we use resources remains essentially unchanged. The end result is predictable. According to the International Resource Panel, at a gross domestic product growth rate of 2.2% by 2060, we will require a 110% increase in global resource extraction. That is, if we stick to the current economic models. So it's obvious that we must change, because we cannot stick to the current economic models. Not if we want to cool the earth, not if we want to preserve nature, not if we want to end pollution and waste, and not if we want to reach the Sustainable Development Goals and our aspiration and agreement to end poverty and hunger. Yes, we have seen action to improve resource efficiency in specific industries and areas, and we salute that. But that has not translated into widespread adoption. Now, part of the problem is that science doesn't always reach decision makers in a way that is relevant and actionable. That is why the value chain approach to action on sustainable consumption and production proposed by the One Planet Network IRP task group is so important. The value chain approach is a methodology for catalyzing science-based policy actions on sustainable consumption and production. This approach does so in 4 ways. Allow me to go over these. First, it integrates the natural and social sciences to map resource use and environmental impacts along the value chains and understand the systems within which resource use takes place. Second, it applies systems analysis to identify drivers of behavior and barriers to change and find key points of intervention. And third, it consolidates existing action and collaboration to create a common agenda. And fourth, it ensures it is practical and actionable by zooming in on specific resource uses along the value chain. The methodology has already been applied and delivered insights. We learned, for example, that the majority of natural resource use and environmental impact in food systems take place at the primary production stage. However, primary producers have a limited ability to shape food systems, so food companies, retail, and food services become critical to making those transformational changes that we want to see. So this approach heralds a new phase of science policy collaboration between the IRP and the One Planet Network. For the IRP, a value chain approach can help to focus research priorities, respond to knowledge needs of practitioners, and identify key data gaps. For the One Planet Network, the approach can provide a strengthened relevance and renewed mandate beyond 2022. UNEP will certainly look at this approach in our new medium-term strategy. I'm grateful to the members of the One Planet Network and the International Resource Panel Task Group for creating this methodology. A special thanks as well to the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development of Argentina, the Ministry of Environment of Finland, the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management of the Netherlands, the Department of Environmental Affairs of South Africa, and the European Commission. We are at the beginning of the decade in which humanity must act quickly and decisively on the 3 planetary crises. We cannot solve these crises without a global shift to sustainable consumption and production. The value chain approach will be a valuable tool to make this shift happen.
Thank you very much, Inga, for that. But also, I'd like to very much thank the Center for Responsible Business, UN Habitat, the World Resources Forum, WWF International, and Saudi Green Building Forum for all the support we've had in this task group. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the science is clear on the need to decouple socioeconomic development from natural resource-based use and the positive impacts this would have on cutting greenhouse gas emissions, protecting biodiversity, and reducing pollution. Yet this evidence does not always reach key decision makers in a way that's relevant and actionable. Stakeholders, whether governments or businesses, need comprehensive and tailored information to help identify priorities, implement strategies, and monitor impacts around the sustainable management of natural resources. To meet this need, the United Nations Environmental Assembly requested that the One Planet Network and the International Resources Panel to form a task group to catalyze science-based policy action on sustainable consumption and production. This is UNEA Resolution 4 Res 1. In addition, it required that the task group complete its work in time to present the outcome to the Environment Assembly in its 5th session, which is, as you know, starting next week. The IRP and One Planet Network formed the task group comprising experts on natural resource use from the IRP and practitioners on SAP from across the One Planet Network in response to this resolution. Today, I have great pleasure to invite Mr. Arthur Ice, who will now present the important work of the task group. Arthur, over to you.
Thank you, Lydia, for that kind introduction, and good morning, afternoon and evening to all participants. I'm proud to have been asked to present the main findings of the task force that Lydia already introduced, and to talk a little on the value chain approach. What I will do in the coming minutes is to explain what we mean by that approach, its key steps and features, and its added value compared to current instruments. But first of all, let's frame the context a little bit. For insights on management of natural resources and raw materials to support pathways towards SCP and delivery of the Agenda 2030, it is necessary to understand natural resources in relation to economic activities and the cycle of production and consumption that are center stage on this slide. And to be honest, this may look pretty linear to you instead of circular, but please remember that this is a tool to analyze in order to identify options for more circularity. These economic activities, of course, require a resource input that can be natural resource inputs, water, forest, land, or material resources and finished materials, metals, fossil fuels, gravel, etc. And of course, these economic activities result in the known environmental and socio-economic impacts, and it is important to address both categories of impact. Next slide, please. So what do we actually mean when we say value chain? The value chain is comprised of all activities that provide and receive value throughout the life cycle of a product or a service, from production to disposal after use, and includes aspects such as the business models, investments, and stakeholders. Value chains are therefore distinct from supply chains, which consider the production of a product or service, and also distinct from life cycles, which consider the production of a product or service and its consumption and end of life, whether disposal or reuse or recycling, whatever. Value chains consider the broader socio-economic context within which products and services are produced, consumed, and disposed of, taking into account systemic and structural influences, legal systems, financial systems, regulations, government policies, as well as factors such as demographics, culture, and social norms. And the value chain will typically include a number of stages that you can see on this slide. Of course, that may vary between sectors, products, and geographical locations, but they will have a typical number of these stages. Key takeaway from this slide is, though, the inclusion of the broader social, cultural, and economic context. Next slide, please. Okay, now that we've seen what we mean when we say value chain, what then is a value chain approach? Well, as we've already heard from the executive director, it's basically a methodology designed to identify key points of intervention within economic systems to reduce natural resource use and environmental impacts caused by production and consumption, and to define a common agenda for action. And it can best be summarized in 3 steps. Firstly, an in-depth analysis of the value chain is undertaken, and it will tell you where in that value chain the resource use actually takes place, where the impacts are. It will also tell you why that is the case by applying a systems analysis to understand the drivers, the barriers, the feedback loops that cause the actors along the various stages of the value chain to behave in the way they do. And through this analysis, key points of intervention, or hotspots as we've called them in the task force, can be identified. Secondly, existing activities of SCP practitioners, maybe governments, UN agencies, civil society, academics, business, are mapped along the stages of the value chain. A comparison of the key points of intervention identified in step 1 with the mapping of existing activities in step 2 then tells us where the activity is in line with what the science tells us is a priority, and where there are gaps and opportunities to direct or redirect action. Thirdly, multi-stakeholder consultations are undertaken with a diverse set of actors representing all stages of the value chain to define a common agenda for concerted action that can transform the system. And in the next slides, I will take you through these steps using examples from 3 value chains that the task force has analyzed on textiles, the food system, and construction. I will not go into the specifics in this presentation. They merely serve to illustrate the approach, but of course, much more information can be found in the full report. So, what is actually happening? And that's the question for the first step, and that's what is shown on this slide. What is the resource use and where are the impacts? The mapping of available data and information to key stages of the value chain allows to filter and distill large volumes of information on natural resource and material use and the impacts involved. And the task force, while developing and testing the value chain approach, analyzed a large number of reports of the UNEP International Resource Panel, the prime science policy interface that does for natural and material resources and their impacts what the IPCC does for climate and IPBES for biodiversity. The example provided on this slide is the mapping of natural resource use along the food value chain. And as I said, we will not discuss today the specific sectoral applications. It's just an example to illustrate the steps of the value chain approach. And what this slide clearly shows is that by synthesizing available data along the value chain, it is possible to understand what activities require most resources. And in the case of the food value chain, that's obviously the primary production stage. Next slide, please. So another element of the first step is to apply a systems analysis. As I said, including the social, cultural, and economic dimensions, as well as their interrelationships. That's a key feature of the approach. So while the mapping of resource use and impacts along the value chain shows what is happening at different stages of the value chain, applying a systems analysis to it shows why it is happening. And by identifying and understanding the systemic barriers and drivers along the value chain, it is then possible to understand how to change the what. Drivers such as institutions, regulations, technology, demographics, markets, and other socio-economic and cultural factors actually shape the operations along the value chain. Again, this is an example from the construction value chain, but it's just for illustration. Now, each of these drivers is a possible point of intervention to positively shape the way the sector works and to move towards a more sustainable situation. And the drivers and the structure of the value chain also largely determine the level of influence, the behavior, and the power of certain actors, and thus their ability to contribute to the solutions. And it's that level of influence which is the third element of the analysis in step 1 of our value chain approach. Next slide, please. So the mapping of data will have identified stages of the value chain where the majority of the natural resource use and impacts occur. However, that does not automatically follow that the solutions are then only to be found at those stages of the value chain. The example shown here is from the construction value chain again. Most of the resources are used during material production, during construction activities and the operations of buildings or infrastructure. However, key decisions are not made by the actors working at these stages. Key decisions are actually made elsewhere and quite far from where resources are being used and where environmental impacts occur. So the combination of the mapping of natural resource use and environmental impacts along the value chain and application of a systems lens provide an overview of where what is happening and why it is happening in a given sector. And combining that forms the evidence base to pose the question, then where to act and identify key intervention points or hotspots, as we call them, along the value chain. And as stated, where to act is not always the same as where the resources are most used or where the impacts are biggest. Next slide, please. Which brings us to step 2. Now knowing where the hotspots for action are, who is doing what, where and how? Who is currently acting and where are the opportunities for additional or redirected action? The example provided on this slide is the mapping of initiatives across stakeholder groups and areas of expertise of the One Planet Network, yet another pillar of global SCP action on the food value chain. It provides a clear visualization of areas in which solutions already exist, where expertise can be leveraged, and other areas where there are clear gaps, such as processing and packaging, logistics and transport phase in this example. So such mapping of initiatives, be it policies, activities, from all actors of the value chain, addressing different stages of the value chain, provides a basis to identify what initiatives are already addressing key hotspots and that can be leveraged and further coordinated to have greater impact, and will help to identify major gaps in addressing or understanding key hotspots and trade-offs that deserve particular attention, more attention than they are currently getting. Next slide, please. Which brings us to step 3. I'm almost there, ladies and gentlemen. So after steps 1 and 2, we have an understanding of what the resource use is, what the impacts are, how the system works, where the hotspots for action are, where actual action is being taken, and hence where the need for strengthening action or new additional action is. And it is then vital to develop a common agenda for change and prioritize action, specific to a stage of the value chain or to an actor. And that's the essence of step 3. This is undertaken through a participatory process engaging different stakeholders across the value chain. And we should not be too modest or choosy, if that's even a word, in involving players of all sizes and from all market segments. The participatory approach ensures tapping into the bodies of lay and practical knowledge that is collectively held among SCP practitioners, as well as ensuring their buy-in for the implementation of the common agenda. Can I have the next and final slide? Yeah, thank you. So that completes a very quick run-through of the 3 steps of the value chain approach. And some of you may have had, at some point in this presentation, the feeling of, yeah, sure, that makes sense, and we are already doing this or that. So what's new? Well, to be honest, I might even agree with you on that. Much of the elements presented are known and are being applied. Not so much new was discovered or developed by the task force, but much remained to be learned and brought together. And we have learned and we have brought together. And to me, the essence and innovation of the value chain approach, its added value to me as a policymaker, is that it really brings together building blocks in a structured, systemic manner that ensures a scientifically rigorous, holistic, and inclusive analysis and allows for targeted practical action. So the message of the task force, I think, is that we are ready for SCP policies 2.0. We need to step up our efforts, as we've heard from the executive director. And now we have this coherent, systemic approach to do exactly that. The value chain approach significantly improves the focus and effectiveness of our policies and actions, reduces the risk of working hard, but on the wrong end. And over the last year, I've seen it work for different value chains, pointing the members of the task force to new, currently underserviced hotspots for our actions. Ladies and gentlemen, I've gone through the approach quickly and roughly, but I do hope that I have inspired you and raised your appetite for more information. And I would therefore invite you to read the full report, appreciate its richness, and please, while reading, identify ways in which this approach can actually help you step up efforts on SCP in your everyday professional work. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you very much, Atta. That was very clear and a very interesting presentation, and I'm sure it's going to add to a really rich discussion. We're going to have a lot of questions and answers, I'm sure, with regard to the details of your presentation, but let's keep that for later. But now, may Atta please keep your video on, but can I also invite Rodrigo and Isabella and Bridget and Leohando to also put their videos on so that we can have a panel discussion around what we've just heard. Isabella and Rodrigo and Bridget. Oh, Rodrigo, sorry, you're there. Bridget? Okay, let me begin. So I would request you also to keep your mics muted while the other person is speaking. So this is going to be a panel discussion on SCP in action, taking forward some of the messages that you've just very, very well articulated by Atta and which you've just heard. Let me start with Rodrigo. Rodrigo, you are the chair of the 10xFP, and you also have a very important position in Argentina. What recommendations from this task group report would be useful for Argentina? And how do you think they could trigger any action on sustainable consumption and production, which we all know now is key to any kind of action on planetary crises? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Ligia. First of all, I would like to thank the IRP and One Planet Network for inviting me to participate in this event to exchange ideas on how to apply the value chain approach. While I was preparing my words now, a question came to my mind. What is value and what will remain valuable in this new time after the COVID? And I reminded an article I read last year, April 16, written by Mark Carney, the governor of Bank of England, The Economist, and I will quote his words. He said, "Value will change in the post-COVID world. On one level, that's obvious. Valuations of global financial markets have imploded, with many suffering their sharpest declines in decades. More fundamentally, the traditional drivers of value have been shaken. New ones will gain prominence, and there's a possibility that the gulf between what markets value and what people value will close." That brings to my mind a lot of questions, and I think that this is a good way to enter into this analysis and this valuable report that the task force has developed. I really think that scarce resources of the 20th century were financial, were money, and in the 21st century, natural resources are scarce and valuable, and we should work on that. The Marxist society is challenged by the pandemic and clear signs of weakness in our development model arise, and it is time for transformation, and we need to make the most of this unique opportunity, maybe the last one for putting things on path. Translating scientific knowledge into actionable policies is key for transforming the way we're doing things, and this report is very useful on that regard. As recovery from the pandemic starts, we are looking to transform this unprecedented challenge into an opportunity to explore new development models founded upon sustainable patterns. But in order to advance this transition, we need to focus our resources on the most effective actions and at the same time understand their implications. Therefore, the holistic and systemic features of the value chain approach are aligned to our requirements of considering a broad number of actors, such as different levels of government, industry, and civil society, as well as considering the different effects that policies have along the value chain in order to prevent or adequately prepare for collateral consequences and utilizing the opportunities for synergies. Incorporating the actionable feature of the value chain approach when taking actions means for us finding the right balance into a change that is broad enough to be meaningful, but which it, at the same time is focused enough in order to that our efforts into lifting barriers or accelerating drivers for improvement may be translated into concrete action on the ground. When considering the results of the report for specific sectors, buildings and constructions is naturally a key one, specifically for emerging economies that are expanding their built environment to deal with existing housing deficits, as well to accommodate expanding populations and cities. This means that this is key that we build what is needed, but understanding the different options for balancing trade-offs in achieving different SDGs. Since, for example, building adequate infrastructure is an undeniable requirement to provide decent living conditions, and in order to continue along each of our development pathways, we have to consider these interlinkages, since trade-offs are plentiful and resources to promote change are often scarce. As the report proposes, in order to have a more sustainable buildings and construction sector, we need to have a clear perspective into what is being built, how much it is being built, and how is it being built. We are currently working in these areas by incorporating energy efficiency and renewable energy into social housing, as well as through facilitating the incorporation of environmental and especially climate and biodiversity consideration in urban planning at the local level. This means, as the report proposes, working on the planning and design stage of the value chain to shape the activity in the order steps of the value chain, such as the construction stage, that have the most actual impact on resource use. This approach can be at the same time more actionable and effective than trying to work directly on the construction stage. As this example shows, focused efforts for policy making aimed at hotspots in the specific sector can trigger action on sustainable consumption and production along the value chain. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. That was a very actionable agenda that you already have. But let me go to another continent now, and let me invite Mr. Reuters. What do you think is the value added of the value chain approach to South Africa?
Lydia, thank you very much, and good day to all the participants. Well, of course, with the context, in the context of South Africa, we've seen and also experienced how the economic, globally, the economic and employment fallout as a result of COVID-19 has impacted and exacerbated a lot of the challenges that we struggle with as a country, relating to low economic growth, high levels of inequality, unemployment, and poverty. But for just a bit more than a decade, we've seen concerted efforts in focusing on driving the transition to a green and circular economy through specific policy frameworks like the New Growth Path, the Green Economic Accord, the National Development Plan. These frameworks identify and analyze various critical drivers, as we've seen, is quite an important aspect of the value chain approach. The impacts on socioeconomic development, industrialization and competitiveness, education and skills development, And these drivers are primarily targeted through a lot of action plans that's been developed. So the value add that's presented by the value chain approach becomes quite clear and very relevant when we start to look at the 5 principles of the approach. The process, in terms of the process of building and rebuilding, given the new normal that we're facing on the various sector and action plans. And within South Africa, we have, for instance, plans like the Industrial Policy Action Plan, which is a long-term industrial plan that focuses on industrial sectors, as well as a program plan called Operation Pakisa, specifically looking at expediting the implementation of objectives in the National Development Plan that focuses on the waste economy and what we call the oceans economy. So when we look at the principles and we look at the aspect of being holistic, which speaks to providing a picture of the actors and processes and drivers, this becomes quite critical in a policy framework set up for South Africa. But also look at the systemic aspect that speaks to the drivers that's identified through these policies. The focus on inclusiveness and the responsibilities of actors becomes quite important. And when we look at an example like the sector master plan development that we follow, these master plans development entails a full value chain analysis, as well as looking at the full involvement of industrialists and workers, aimed at building local capacities, creating employment, creating a platform for local suppliers to grow. It becomes quite important to start incorporating this element or this principle. Another principle that speaks to being relatable, which is quite critical if you look at sustainable consumption and production. It speaks to anchoring the national resource use in environmental impacts. And if you look at, for example, the extended producer responsibility regulations that aims to drive the establishment of EPR schemes, the focus of 4 sectors that we have identified in South Africa, this again become a value add to incorporate into that developmental approach. Of course, another principle that's quite important, as mentioned earlier, as mentioned by Rodrigo as well, it needs to be actionable. This is a critical, this is quite an important principle, ensuring that decision makers prioritize that resources are targeted and focused to avoid wastage that's already for resource that's already under pressure due to global economic contractions. And there we've seen how organizations like the National Cleaner Production Center and other role players have ongoingly support the development and implementation of resource efficiency, energy efficiency programs like industrial symbiosis and life cycle thinking to support industry to build the capacity and to develop national networks. Of course, the replicability aspect becomes quite important when we're scaling up and when we start to build back. The aspect of creating coherent policy frameworks and to drive an understanding of how to better impact sustainable consumption and production and product design becomes quite important when the focus of this approach can be applied in different sectors and products and geographical areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leander. That was fascinating. And you brought up a very important aspect, which is what is the role of each group, what is the role of each stakeholder in understanding these different parts of the value chain. And that takes me to try to understand how the scientific groups, for example, would embrace such a methodological approach. And I turn to Isabella. Isabella, you've been involved in this from the start, as the IRP was one of the main sources of information to this task group. So could you tell us how possibly scientific groups could use this approach? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Lígia. Good morning for everyone from Brazil, and welcome to the other friends here in this panel. I'm very happy to join you today. So this is a really good question because this work is in many ways a first, okay, even for us. And it's the first time that we work in more coordinated and structured manner, okay, a strategic partner of International Resource Panel. It's the first time we co-develop insights for policymakers with members of the network. And it's also the first time we work together to envision a common agenda based on science of the International Resource Panels and on the initiatives and policy of One Planet Network. And the REP, One Planet Network. And also, it's in many ways, that's a huge step forward, not only methodologically speaking, but also for enhanced science policy cooperation, understanding, and the action on sustainable consumption production. The methodology itself, the value chain approach, may be the way to generate more pragmatic and action-oriented narrative in International Resource Panel reports. Be pragmatic, and you know how important it is for the political world, okay? The task group noted that many of our reports are useful for awareness raising and audience engagement purposes, but the recommendations can sometimes be too general and the high level to guide the implementation of specific measures on the ground. International Resource Panel reports introduce important concepts and principles with a lot of relevant data and analysis that help frame a challenge and potential policy solutions. But some practitioners need more sector and regional specific information to apply these concepts. It's very important here, if you want, and I do believe that you should influence, for example, net zero carbon emissions global strategy, we need to understand the regional and national demands and how you go into this world, okay? And they also need to understand some key dynamics with that sector region who holds the largest powers for change. How is the market structure? How does it affect people's livelihoods? The value chain approach could help us to exactly do this. My third point here, because we don't have much time, is as expressed in the report, the approach is pretty straightforward and can be used beyond the sectors we applied it to: food, construction, and textiles. Scientific groups like the panel, IPCC, and IPPS have been sounding alarms about the triple planetary crisis, as Inger mentioned, and also for decades. The value chain approach could help this group to focus on solutions, actions by bringing the perspectives of users. It's like how we can act. The global society is asking how we can act, not only the diplomacy world. And this is very, very important. In scientific panels like IRP, we seek not to produce science for science sake. We need to deliver science that can strengthen the consensus of policy options, identify solutions, and guide actions for consensus for environmental sustainability. And the problems we are currently seeing, at least from the resource perspectives, are quite complex. They will require deep analysis of data on socioeconomic and environmental trends, understanding why actors behave in a certain manner and what can be done to overturn a broken system. For this, there is no other way than to work with the users of the information, or, as I like to call them, the sustainable consumption agents of change. Okay? They are the ones putting together policy package, business strategy, community actions. They invest, they build, they produce, and they consume. The value chain approach helps the scientific community building bridge with the agents of change to make sure that we are doing doing the things that work and matter in the decade of action. So, as my friend mentioned, we are ready for Sustainable Consumption Policy 2.0, including the scientific players. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Isabella. And I like that sustainable consumption production agents of change. Maybe we then turn to some of our key agents of change here. And we have Rijit Sengupta representing the Center for Responsible Business in India. Rijit, the term value chain very much originated in the private sector. What is particularly attractive in this to the private sector or to industry more generally?
Thanks a lot, Lygia, for that question. And at the outset, thanks a lot to the IRP and the UNEP and the One Planet Network for giving us this opportunity, not only to be part of the panel, but also to be part of this task group. It has been an extremely fascinating and a learning experience. If I may do so, I would like to answer your question into three parts, break down what we understand by the private sector more from an operational perspective here. The first would be to understand why is it going to be, or why is it likely to be attractive for multinational corporations and international businesses and buyers. I don't have to belabor the point of that international commerce and trade is a very complex game. Multinational corporations, international businesses, more so after the COVID, are always trying to develop their capability to understand and be on top of the information which will give them an understanding on where the challenges and the risks lie when it comes to the use of resources across geographies, across topographies, across cultures, across regions. What the value chain approach does is that if it is applied in the right manner, it can give valuable information for the multinational corporations, international brands, buyers across jurisdictions about where those challenges and the risks lie when it comes to use of finite resources in order to achieve sustainable consumption and production outcomes. The second point that I'd like to make is basically why could it be an attractive proposition for suppliers and manufacturers in the global value chain, especially the manufacturers, and the businesses in the network of production, the region of the world that I come from here in Asia. And I feel that from our work and from the work of the others, what is emerging is that post-COVID, the most important challenge for many of the suppliers, manufacturers is access to markets, is access to finance, access to capital. And if we are able to work with suppliers and manufacturers with this value chain approach, what this will help them is for them to demonstrate to the potential MNCs that I talked about earlier that they have full visibility and traceability and transparency of their operations, and they know where those risks and challenges of resource use lie. So that can help them be competitive in the international, when it comes to accessing international markets, international finance partners, and so on. And that's why I think that it's going to be we feel it's going to be very useful for the suppliers and the manufacturers from this part of the world as well. Thirdly, the third point that I want to make is that we also feel it is going to be useful it could be useful both for the international businesses, MNCs, and for the suppliers and manufacturers together. And the reason I'm saying this is because there's a fair bit of attention now on having a balanced dialogue and collaboration between the suppliers and buyers on one side, the suppliers with the buyers, the investors with the producers, and so on, north and the south, if I may, very crudely. So if we are able to look at some of these sectors and beyond and see which are those actors, if we can work with them together, what this will ensure is that it will develop and augment their capacities together at the same level to speak the same language, to be able to understand an approach, and especially as Arthur said, there are three very, very critical elements of this value chain approach. The first, it takes into consideration for the first time context and culture, which has been lacking in many of these internationally developed methodologies, standards, tools, etc. Secondly, it also highlights a systems approach, where you look at the system as a whole and not really look at it in parts. And thirdly, and most importantly, it also reduces the distance between the decision making to where the actual impact is happening. So I think these are some thoughts at this point of time that I'd like to put forward, where, which I feel makes this value chain approach pretty attractive, given the timing of the release of this tool. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. That was really very clear. And so let me push you to the next question, which is, if you are directing the Center for, you are directing the Center for Responsible Business in India, how would you use this methodology to take this forward? What would be a strategy? You've already highlighted some of the benefits, but have you given it some thought of how to push it forward?
Well, what kind of an answer do you want? Do you want an academic answer, or do you want a serious operational answer? If you
operational answer.
Okay. If you want an academic answer, the answer is that we will work with all our actors. We will work with all the number of businesses we work across these sectors and beyond. We also do a fairly large annual conference, and we do a session there and publicize the value chain approach. So that's a more academic answer. I think if we were to find a more operational, serious answer, that has to be done together. We can't only do it by ourselves. It has to be done together by each member of the task group, by the IRP, the One Planet Network, and I think most importantly by UNEP, to provide that leadership and to demonstrate that this is not just a document that we had to produce because there was a resolution passed in the earlier, UNEA, but this is a document which has to be read, which has to be used, and which has to be applied on the field. And we are absolutely happy. I don't think, we are representing the task group, and all the 15 members would be very happy to rally with the leading, the leadership provided by UNEP or IRP. So I think the idea would basically be for UNEP and IRP to take a lead on this and to identify those sectors, those actors, and to work simultaneously with the international buyers, brands on one side, and the suppliers and manufacturers, and not make that mistake of only working with the brands and international, businesses, and not providing any attention on the suppliers and manufacturers. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. And we have many questions for which have already popped up on the chat, but I will still go through with this so that we get your perspectives on what you want to do next with this. Let me ask Leander, in the National Cleaner Production Centers, how could you use this strategy? Quick answers, because we have lots and lots of questions.
Thanks, Lydia. I think that one of the exciting areas is when we look at the geographical focus on special economic zones and industrial park revitalization. We also have, of course, as I mentioned earlier, master plans that have been developed that is very value chain focused. So strengthening those master plans, and we've in the country looked at the textile sector already, as well as looking at the poultry and automotive sectors. So those are really good starting points to start applying this very exciting approach. Thank you.
Very good. Rodrigo, how would you do this in Argentina?
Thank you.
You've done a lot of thinking.
Well, definitely, this is a very good approach for promoting a dialogue, intersectoral dialogue, on how to increase awareness on the resource efficiency agenda, to expand this transition at all levels and at all sectors. And I really think that this approach is useful to have something clear, concrete to discuss with the private sector, with the industry on how to work together for promoting this. So I really think it's a very useful tool for promoting SCP. Also, we would like to integrate the contents of this tool into our law on environmental education. We are promoting that discussion in the Congress in these coming days. And we are also promoting a law on extended responsibility of producers And we understand that this approach will be very helpful to nurture the discussion on that law. So many things to be done and hard work, but I think that this is very helpful for us. Thank you.
Wonderful. Atta, what would you do in Netherlands with this approach? You spoke so eloquently about it.
Well, when presenting the three steps, I thought that I forgot to mention that you can actually start with step 3, which is very attractive because you can't actually properly do the first steps without engaging all stakeholders and without analyzing together and coming to conclusions about the systemic issues together. And that's what we are trying to do in our implementation program for the circular economy in the Netherlands, where we have 5 so-called transition agendas for specific sectors, where we actually sit down and talk to not only the private sector and companies, but also scientists and NGOs to collectively analyze what is happening in a specific sector, like construction, like plastics, like consumer goods, and define on the basis of that exactly this common view and these prioritized actions, which should lead the Netherlands to halving the use of primary resources by 2030 and achieving circularity by 2050, which is ambitious, but well, as I said, we need to step up our efforts.
Great. Isabella, I'm sure this is going to influence the strategy of the IRP. Do you have any thoughts towards how you want to improve this or not?
Yes.
I'm putting you on the spot.
Yes, it was, first of all, it was a fantastic, amazing experience for us in International Resource Panel. I think that this value chain approach delivered valuable insights that you may want to use this to elaborate better our reports and to go into deep scientific data and information to rearrange in such a way that you can use better for decision process and for decision makers. So I think that this implies agreeing how to use scientific information and engage stakeholders and the users of this information, the definition of a content and the format. It's very important how this will facilitate us to play as an influencer, as a global influencer, but really with a strategic targets and understanding better what are the key pieces of the game that must change as fast as possible or as soon as possible. My second comment here is that we are undertaking our strategic planning exercise to develop the next work program, as you know, and the value chain approach has been mentioned by several of our steering committee members as an important methodology to be used for identification of some of the priority areas. I think that also have some inputs, very interesting, how we need to include in our future work. For example, integrate knowledge from political economy, sociology, and anthropology that provide the understanding of the socioeconomic system within which natural resource use and environment impact occur. Also, include more information on informal sector, socioeconomic implications, and for emerging economies developing countries. My last comment here, because I don't have much time, is that in my case here, in Brazil, I also would like to use this to perform better as an influencer, as a political influencer for net zero carbon emissions in regional and national strategies, and also, very important here, how we can influence environment, social and government ESG strategy platform for private and financial sector performance and transparency. This is very important to how you can bring things together. I think that Arthur mentioned this, that we need to bring together these building blocks. And this methodology is really amazing because bring us scientific world in the political and economic world in a concrete way to make the citizens our co-responsible for the solutions. So really amazing. We have really hard work the next steps, but really, really good challenges. Thank you.
Very good. And now you have some really tough questions, all of you, to answer. So we have over 20 questions, but I'm going to ask them, depending on the time that we have. And some of these go back to the presentation that you made, Arthur. So the first question is to you. This is from Talia Hussain, who says, I'm a researcher focused on sustainable futures and the consumer marketplaces. Approaching the issue of production from a market orientation, you can argue that a good has no value until the point of exchange where value is realized and a human need is met. Until then, every effort, investment, and expenditure is a liability incurred. In the textile industry during the pandemic, we've seen a live demonstration of this. Failure to create value through the exchange means workers weren't paid and firms are collapsing while warehouses sit full of finished goods. If we understand that what is being created through activity in this sector is not value creating, but liability creating, is it appropriate to use the value chain approach to assess the textile industry, or is this a wrong mindset? So maybe, Arthur, you want to explain what the value chain approach is again, so that it's not seen only as an economic approach. Over to you.
Thank you. That's a really complicated question, but it goes back to the question actually that Rodrigo raised in his first intervention on the question, what is value? And it's not just the economic value, it's not just the monetary value that of course is important in making investment decisions, but it's also about the natural value that we often invest upfront. And do not or rarely take into account. So to me, the value chain approach is about value in a much broader sense than just economic or monetary value.
Absolutely, that's a very good answer, but it's a very good question, and it forces us to think much more into this. Let me go to another question, and this is for Isabella, from Gete Shetu, one of our IRP members. How can we address the landscape management as one component of the value chain approach, as this is often the missing link?
Really, it's a fantastic question. In my personal opinion, we have to focus today when we go into value chains, to the food suppliers. And we need also to go to forestry suppliers. It's very interesting that you can manage this. And we need to move beyond the free deforestation agenda. Okay, we need to understand how indeed what is our approach considering landscapes and the land use management today around the world. So, and also we need to make sure that, for example, agriculture, tropical agriculture is fully different of non-tropical agriculture. And we need also to understand when we go into value chains, social realities when we go into food producers countries, and really make sure how we can bring the culture aspects that this population, these players have with the land use, indeed that we can understand how we can change, how we can influence. So my opinion is that in short-term perspective, we need to understand better the role of food producers and also food security at the global level, but at the regional level, how the global south will come into this agenda, how restoration agenda could play an innovative role, considering not only environmental service, but also job creation, generation, regional development, biodiversity assets preserved together, water supply, and other strategic regional local needs addressing. It's very important to understand this. And my feeling is that we need also to bring land use into the climate change constituency beyond deforestation. We used to manage Paris Agreement, consider energy constituency, but land use is a key one if you want to bring global south together. So my feeling is that we need international resource panel is going into this, bring land use and resource efficiency, really good reports have been done the last years. And I do believe that it's a critical and strategic track that we need to move forward if we want to bring some important countries, important society, meaning, as you know that I like to use this expression, the green global south expression in an innovative way in this century. So value chain is critical for this. Okay, it's absolutely critical because you also hear dialogues when you go to global south with the countries that have natural resource assets, and you need to go there to convince the guys that you need the new directions to bring protection and production together.
Excellent. So political economy questions, as you mentioned earlier, are very key to this. Next question is for Rodrigo. How could this value chain approach, and this is from Martin Ron Brossard from Switzerland, how could the value chain approach reshape the 10YFB strategy and programs for its new mandate after 2022? Rodrigo, over to you.
Thank you, Ligia. As you mentioned, we are co-chairing with Martin from Switzerland the 10YFB platform. We really are thinking and doing our best effort to think about what is next for SCP and what are the potential for SCP. As you know, SCP as SDG 12 is one of the most interlinked with other SDGs because it relates to our lifestyle. It relates to our way of living, the way we are doing things. And definitely this question about the value and about how to make the most of each resource we take from nature and use it in a most wise way must be a guide for our SDG platform, and there are many opportunities on that regard. So we need to continue the dialogue with all the stakeholders and the board members to increase the awareness on this approach and how useful it is.
Music to my ears. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The next question is to Rijit. This is from Tanushree Shukla. Do you think we could use this approach to informal and unorganized sectors and communities?
Thanks a lot, Ligia, for that question, and also to Tanushree for it. Since the value chain approach talks about a systems analysis and a systems lens, it generally and definitely will take into consideration all the critical actors who fall within the limits of the resource use, which we are talking about. So definitely in certain sectors where the informal sector are involved in resource use, for example, mining, for example, even to a certain extent, what Isabella talked about, forest driven commodities, for example, definitely it will. It's not about whether it'll include a particular stakeholder or not, but what is most important is that it includes the most relevant stakeholder at a point where resource use and impact is significant. So I think a generalization will not be possible at this stage, but depending on the application of the sector, definitely it has the potential to take into consideration the informal sector and also the most sort of marginalized communities, if I may. I don't know if that answers your question.
It's not my question, but you have answered it, which is great.
Sorry, yes.
But also a question, a related question, and maybe I will ask Leo Handel to answer this one. How can this approach support small and medium enterprises? The National Cleaner Production Center works with SMEs, so how would this approach support them?
Thank you, Ligia. That's an important question. We've seen how the value chain approach endeavors to ensure that all actors are important and all actors are involved, and SMEs are important in that entire spectrum. So the support that SMEs can receive from this approach is first and foremost assistance with understanding the value chain. A lot of SMEs obviously operate in some instances from a survivalist position and struggle. So understanding and knowing what are the plans and getting the benefit of the analysis that's done so that they are included, that becomes important. So that participation aspect, now make sure that their views and their circumstances are incorporated in actions as well as in plans and strategies that's developed to address the impact areas.
Excellent, thank you. I have an interesting question here from Greg, Helen, to either Arthur or Isabella. And it says, why in the case of food does the report summarize that economic and financial measures are limited? Taxes, subsidies create very significant incentives or disincentives along the value chain. Is this a statement recognizing limited application of these measures to date or the lack of potential of these measures? If the latter, why? Either Arthur or Isabella.
Arthur first. Arthur first.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Well, I certainly don't think it's the latter. I mean, there's a huge potential for the right investments in ensuring that the food system works and functions better and reaches sustainability. I think this text in the report refers to the fact that currently financial flows are not too well directed towards reaching sustainable consumption and production in the food system. So that would be my explanation for this text, which I don't have in front of me. So I've not no actual knowledge of the context right now, but yeah, there you go.
Yes, I think that Arthur is right. Okay, and but I think that value chain change or should change. Because what I'm seeing today in Brazil, for example, when we have this lack of public governance to tackle deforestation, we have now a new movement from the private sector, considering the international pressure. Also, the private banks in Brazil, they are joining to have a new agenda and solutions to stop deforestation in Amazon region and also go into other biomes for biodiversity preservation, and also bring new innovative tools, and the value chain is one of them that the guys have been discussing. So my feeling is that it's not enough for what I have today, but value chains can change or can influence this picture in such a way that we can change fast. And this is what's happening today. It's really hard. It's a hard task. It's tough, really, really complex. But because we need to bring private sector and business sector and also supranational players, etc., and not necessarily resolve the full mandate, because tackle deforestation in my country means law enforcement, and we used to know how to do this. Unfortunately, it seems that it's not a strategic priority for the government today in Brazil. Thank you.
Excellent. So you've just said value chains can also influence perspectives going forward. And that takes me to the next question, which again is to Arthur. Arthur, that's the price of making the presentation. It comes from Francesca Rosa. And she has two questions with regard to the third. One is with regard to the third part of your presentation. And she says it touches upon a more general issue. May I please ask how you are planning to change consumer habits? Many conventional approaches, example awareness raising events or communication campaigns, often have much less effect than expected. Have you planned also more original and effective approaches, more in terms of the theory of practice? And the second question, also to you, relates to data availability, but anyone can answer. I don't want to put too much pressure on Arthur. To have a comprehensive assessment of impacts, we need global high-resolution data, which are usually difficult to collect and often not available. May I please ask how the task force has addressed this issue or plans to address? I'm giving you a hint on how you can address it. Arthur, over to you.
Yes, again, very good questions. Let me start with the latter one, the data availability. For our current analysis so far, the task group has drawn on IRP reports, that in their turn heavily rely on databases like Material Flow database and others. And data availability is, of course, a crucial element, of crucial concern. And well, you've been asking panel members what this this value chain approach might mean for the 10 YFP or for the IRP. I think we should definitely include work on the value chain approach in the work of the IRP, also ensuring that we work on the data availability and that we improve that at the precise and relevant levels. As for the consumer approaches, well, that's been a decade-long debate also in the Netherlands, and which has brought us to desperation almost, because it's indeed quite difficult to change consumer habits. But it's not just about information. I think that sending the right price signals is essential, and we are moving towards true pricing in the Netherlands, so that prices of goods reflect the correct price, including the use they make of natural resources. And as I said in the presentation, the analysis of the cultural dimension is, I think, also extremely important, which provides new insights on how to determine consumer behavior and also change that behavior. We often assume that consumers are rational, where they, in many cases, are not. And how to recognize that and how to influence that is still a field of a lot of research, but I think an avenue that we definitely need to explore.
Excellent answers. Let me give you a bit of a break and turn to the other participants now. So maybe I can ask this question of Rodrigo. Are there any targets or outcomes tied to the adoption of this approach or model? How will you know if your vision is effective? How will you track the adoption of this approach amongst the industry, for example? Anyone can respond. I mean, I've just picked on Rodrigo, but up to you.
Thank you, Ligia. Well, I'm not a specialist on that, but definitely we will need to build an adequate set of indicators. And that set of indicators should be built on a consensus with the private sector. We need to hear from them. What are their possibilities? What are their challenges? We need to consider also that we are on the post-pandemic economic recovery. So we need to try to present this as an opportunity to increase productivity, to increase competitiveness, and not as an extra burden, but an approach that can be helpful for recovery after this stress that we are going through.
That question was from Rose Scott, and she must have anticipated your answer because she has a follow-up question, which says, and I'm going to ask actually Rijit to answer this one. Have you researched why manufacturers and suppliers may not want to adopt a value chain approach?
Well, I need to clarify that this wasn't guided and it wasn't prepared. But, you know, I would say that extra costs, let me tell it in another way. Environment for the private sector means extra cost, barriers, and problems. And our challenge is to transform environment as a catalyzer for sustainable development, for better production, for increase your visibility, the visibility of your brand, to improve your performance as a company, and to create shared value. And we are in the middle of that transition. So I really think that the only way to do it is through the dialogue as a mean for promoting this transformation.
May I add
Excellent.
a comment? May I add a comment?
Yeah, of course, go ahead.
I think that Rodrigo is absolutely right, and but also we cannot forget that the world is changing. The new generations add value for environmental concerns and what environmental protection means. So also, you don't have natural resource stocks to attend all the demands, the global demands, based on the business as usual. We need to change. So if you want to address, and you need to address food security, food safety, food sustainability, we need to find new ways to produce food based on natural resource efficiency, on the inclusive social inclusiveness of social inequalities, try to manage better regional development, etc., etc., etc. It's a new way to face our challenges in this century. We really need to understand that we are in the 21st century. We are not in the last century. I'm so sorry. We changed. Everything is changing. So my feeling is that we need to convince people that, okay, you want to produce, you can have your industry, you can have everything, but I'm so sorry. You would like to stay the next 10 years, the next 30 years, to the next 50 years, okay? And the future, I like to remember everyone here that if you have a child today, you probably will be alive in 2100. So the future is today, and I'm so sorry, okay? This is the reality. So it's a new way to see our challenges, and I'm convinced that the guys will understand in the short term or mid-term perspective. And don't forget that we have the losers. We need to understand who are the losers, okay, and not only who are the winners. And the losers, we need to give additional support. Okay, would you like to change or not? If not, I'm so sorry. Well done. It's over.
Okay.
It will be over. It's true. I'm so sorry. Thank you.
Very good, but let's stick with this, and I'm coming to Rijit now. Rijit, the question here is, companies like Apple or Google use a value chain approach to optimize operations, reduce costs, and improve their operational efficiency. How can we embed sustainability into existing frameworks, particularly to bring SCP principles and solutions to industry leaders? Can you provide any examples of companies in India or globally already applying the value chain approach with a sustainability lens? This is, I think, from Margarita Finnemore. It doesn't say clearly.
Sure, thanks. I had some comments also on the earlier question, but I'll reserve them for later. The issue is that when it comes to the private sector organizations, or maybe let me just rephrase my thoughts here. I think we have reached a stage in our journey as professionals in this realm where we need to redefine what we mean by sustainability. I think there is still a fair bit of thinking across all of us and maybe others that sustainability is this sort of abstract, difficult to measure issue that has been developed somewhere else, and it has been somehow it has come to us either through the value chain or through international development processes, or this, that, and the other. And we tend to forget that sustainability is integrated in our cultures. I mean, Arthur mentioned this earlier, in our heritage, in our everyday life. So we probably, as individuals, whether we are leaders in business, whether we are professionals in our work, whether we are teachers and academics, need to really unlearn what we mean by sustainability, because I still feel even amongst us the term is not very clear of what we mean by sustainability. It's rather and I'm a simplist. I tend to look at things very simply. I think it's very, very easy also to define sustainability, use the three legs of sustainability: social, economic, and environmental. So while why coming specifically to the question why it has not been applied, even and how sustainability can be integrated, there are different ways of looking at, try to identify the risks and the challenges in the social part. The risks might lie in the community, the risks might lie with the workers. Try to identify the challenges in the economic part. The risks might lie in, going back to the earlier question of why companies don't intend to collaborate, because there's always been this idea of competing, especially in sectors where there is cutthroat competition. You want to outdo your competitor, and you want to sort of, so that there's always that sort of dilemma between cooperation and competition. Thirdly, on the environmental part, it's very clear. Look at the resources are finite, period. You can't generate resources beyond a particular limit. So unless and until business leaders, leaders in politics, leaders in academics define and propagate what we mean by sustainability, I think the distance between the abstract and the actual will continue to remain very, very wide. And in India, there are several hundreds of companies who are doing this. I mean, I don't want to get into the names, but whoever is asking the question, talk to me. I'll give you examples. Thanks a lot.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And sometimes I think the reason why all of us can talk to each other is because sustainability is a fuzzy concept. So each of us can interpret it the way we want. But of course, some kind of definition is always good. Here's a question from Zoltan Kalman, the ambassador and permanent representative of Hungary, and to the UN Food and Agricultural Agencies in Rome. And this question is directed to any of the representatives of Argentina, South Africa, or Netherlands. The question: what is the view of panelists about the need for assessing all positive and negative externalities of food systems, applying the true cost accounting principle in order to be able to create the policy environment enabling sustainable transformation? Maybe I start with Arthur, since you mentioned true cost, and then we go to South Africa.
Well, the answer to this question may sound easy, because yes, it's crucial, it's vital. If we do not take all these elements into account, we will never reach a systemic analysis as the value chain approach demands, and we will never be able to design the right policies. Of course, saying that it needs to be done is something different than actually doing it. And practice is more difficult, but yes, we absolutely should make an effort and move fast in that domain in the upcoming years.
Mm-hmm. Leo Hunter, do you want to come in on this question for South Africa?
Thanks, Lydia. Well, I support what Arthur said. I think the important part is to, as we've seen, constantly reviewing and looking at our policies and our plans that emanates from it. Is that constant need to ensure that there is a very real understanding of the negative externalities, and making sure that the policy supports what the reality is. So again, I think just to emphasize what Arthur's sentiment was, it's important, but doing it is not just a once-off, and it's something that will have to be conducted continuously. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rodrigo, do you want to come in for Argentina? Because we're going to stop the questions now because we're almost at the end of time.
This is a very specific question, and it's not my field, so sorry, Ligia, but I don't feel in the capacity of responding something that is accurate.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the participants for the brilliant questions we've had. We still have some more, but we've got to the end of time. So I think it behoves me to make some very quick wrap-up comments. Not that I can wrap this up, it's been too rich to do it, but the intention was to present to you this value chain approach. It's not the end of things. And we've heard many inconvenient facts that have come in, and that's really good, because the more you question, the more we can go deeply into this. You also have told us very clearly what you would like the 10xFP to be thinking about, what would you like the IRP to be doing in the future, or if you haven't, you've pushed us into thinking some more, so that's excellent. We've also understood from all the kinds of questions that were coming that this is not an easy approach to follow, because it requires stakeholder participation with all the different perspectives. It requires to engage, as Isabella said, with political economy questions, but also with financial questions. And all of this requires a considerable amount of dedication, commitment to the larger sustainability question, which, as Rijit very nicely said, is not entirely clear to all of us. But what is really clear to everyone, and I think Inga started with this, is that we are running out of time. And when we are running out of time, we need action. And when you need action, you need to come up with very clear ways in which we can address next steps to going forward. And to me, the value chain approach and what you've heard today, with all its caveats, with all its more things to do, presents a really interesting approach going forward. With this, let me thank you all, the panelists, to Arthur, to everyone here for your brilliant presentations, for your patience, and for answering the questions so very well. Thank you very much, and thank you to all the participants and to the organizers for being here with us today. Have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Congrats, everyone. Okay, bye-bye.
All right, thanks a lot.
Got it. Cecilia, Maria José, you got it, Rodrigo. Yes. Thank you. Kisses, Lígia.
Thank you so much. Congratulations.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.